Autism Canada depends on the generous support of viewers like you. If you find this presentation helpful, consider donating at autismcanada.org.
Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Shore. Stephen presents and consults internationally on adult issues pertinent to education, relationships, employment, advocacy, and disclosure. As discussed in his numerous books, Beyond the Wall, Personal Experiences with Autism and Asperger's Syndrome, Ask and Tell, Self-Advocacy and Disclosure for People on the Autism Spectrum, and the critically acclaimed Understanding Autism for Dummies, and the newly released DVD, Living Along the Autism Spectrum, What It Means to Have Autism or Asperger's Syndrome. Please welcome Stephen Shore.
Thanks for the intro. Well, it's a pleasure to be in front of so many people who are dedicated to helping those on the autism spectrum lead fulfilling and productive lives. We've had a couple of great presentations this morning from Martha Herbert looking at medical and biological aspects of autism. Later on, we had some really good information about transition. And speaking of transition, we're transitioning into promoting successful transition to adulthood. And this is something that's getting more and more thought and more press, because as we're finding out, all of those individuals on the autism spectrum, the leading edge of the increased prevalence rate, the leading edge of that bubble, are now in high school and they're aging out. And the question is, what are we going to do to provide supports for those individuals on the autism spectrum? So one important area of successful transition is employment. Most of us have to work for a living, and that includes those of us on the autism spectrum. So as we look at those characteristics of autism concerning communication, socialization, interests, deep interests, repetitive motions, I think what we need to do is we need to look at them as they are. They're just characteristics. Because what happens is the diagnostic procedure tends to be a deficit model. A child gets diagnosed with autism, the first thing a parent hears, these are all the things your child won't be able to do. Well, what about the things that people with autism can do? And as we think about that, as we look at individuals on the autism spectrum, and taking a lifespan approach, whether they're a young toddler, whether they're middle-aged or older, how does that person spend most of their time? And what can we do to match those to avocational and vocational possibilities? So what are their abilities? What are the interests? What kind of mind does the individual have? Where are their strengths in terms of processing information? Looking at the characteristics. So before we get into that, a little bit about me. Things were pretty typical for me at first. My mother had just a 2-hour labor at 24 hours of age. My wife says I looked like an egg. Then at 18 months, like what happens to about half of us on the autism spectrum, what I often refer to as the autism bomb struck. A loss of functional communication, meltdowns, withdrawal from the environment, self-stimulatory behavior. So in short, I became quite an autistic little kid. My parents had no idea what to do. In those days, autism was blamed on the parents. It was something, basically the mother. We have Bruno Bettelheim to thank for that. I think the real problem was that Bettelheim had a problem with his mother. Fortunately, my parents refuted the professionals' recommendations for institutionalization and convinced the school to take me in about a year. So they were into advocacy before much of what we do today, what we see today, parents advocating for their children, others advocating for people on the autism spectrum. They advocated on my behalf, and during that intervening year, when after the diagnosis and entering that school that initially rejected me, my parents implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program, emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. And this was at a time before even the term early intervention was even conceived of. So, early intervention. What did they do? And it was mostly my mother. My dad was there too, but in those days it was his job to hunt a saber-toothed tiger or a mastodon. And the mother stayed home and did mommy things. Well, first she tried to get me to imitate her, and that didn't work. So then she imitated me. And once she did that, I became aware of her in my environment. And I think the key educational implication is that before any good teaching goes on, you have to develop a relationship with the learner. Once you do that, then you can move them along. And I think that holds true for anyone who's taking care of individuals on the autism spectrum, or actually anybody. Providing support, whether you're an educator, a therapist, a medical professional, a parent, you've got to develop that bond. You have to develop a trusting bond, and then you can move things along. So between the ages 2.5, that's when I got diagnosed, and age 4, speech started to return. It wasn't that clear yet, but it started to return. And I believe that we have the technology now, we have the ability to help individuals on the autism spectrum lead fulfilling and productive lives, and to have that become the rule rather than the exception. We have the ability to do this, whether it's in the biomedical arena, whether it's various therapies such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, and so on, and education. But what we're really challenged with is getting the needed resources to those individuals and also matching those resources to needs. The autism spectrum is incredibly wide, it's incredibly deep and diverse, and so that suggests that different people are going to have different needs and different amount of needs. So, for example, I remember as a child having digestive difficulties. I'd complain that my sides hurt. And the best they knew about biomedical intervention was, let's take the kid off of solid foods, liquids for 3 weeks. Let's see what happens. So whatever became of that, at least my gut healed sufficiently so it didn't cause a problem. But now, knowing what we know now, I probably could have been helped with what we know in the biomedical arena. Sensory issues, people weren't aware of that either. There were definitely needs there, and certainly in the educational behavioral things. Another question we have is, where does autism come from? So let us sing to the tune of Where, Oh, Where Has This Little Dog Gone? Ready, go. Where, oh, where did this autism come from? More from the soprano in the front. Where, oh, where can it be? The bass in the back. With mysteries cut long and eye contact cut short. Oh, where can it be from? Very good. And I think with a little bit more rehearsal, with breath support, singing together, and intonation, we'll be ready for the concert at Autism 1 in Chicago at the end of May. And the thing is, with all the research that we're doing, there's still a lot of questions as to where autism comes from. The best minds in research, we're looking at a genetic predisposition, which then gets triggered by something else. And this morning, Martha Herbert certainly gave us plenty of food for thought as to what those something else's were and what we could do about them. So we're still looking in this area. I think there's a lot to be said for the genetic input component. We see autistic characteristics running in families. I remember meeting the father of the first child I worked with. And I guess it was just a matter of it takes one to know one. I said, "Hey, Dad, I think you're autistic." He didn't like that. Well, then I found out that Dad didn't eat solid foods until he was 9.5. I also found out that Dad had what I call a negative autism diagnosis from Children's Hospital in Boston. After spending 6 months as an outpatient, the result was a letter, "Dear Mom and Dad, your child cannot be autistic because he's talking." Well, now we know what that's called. And Dad now realizes that either he's on the autism spectrum or he's pretty close. It helps him understand his son, who's much more significantly affected and remains nonverbal to today. So as we look at identifying people with autism, as we look at providing supports, and what to do as autism seems to be delivered to us daily on a Federal Express truck, and helping those individuals, perhaps Federal Express has some of the answer, not all of it, but some of the answer. And what I'm talking about is the tug of war between, is there really more autism out there, or are we just better at recognizing it? And I think, like with most things, the answer is in the middle. I think we are better at recognizing it. I know a number of people who were diagnosed as perhaps having mental retardation, perhaps having minimal brain dysfunction or something else. Now we realize that they're on the autism spectrum because society now recognizes autism, or is much better at recognizing autism when it sees it. Just like with this Federal Express logo, some of you may have noticed the arrow between the E and the X, and now the rest of you see it. And what I've done now is I've increased your ability to diagnose white space arrows in Federal Express logos. Just as society is better at recognizing autism. But is that all of it? Is that even most of it? Are we doing something to muck up the environment? Martha Herbert was talking about canaries in coal mines earlier. Is autism just part of a much bigger issue that we're facing because we're mucking up the environment? All I know is that all through grade school, I was the only child I knew on the autism spectrum. And perhaps some of my classmates should have been diagnosed, thinking back to them. But these days, we have entire schools and rooms full of children with autism. And that's something that really needs to be addressed. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, well, perhaps we don't have to think of autism as being a bomb at all, but perhaps with proper intervention in the educational, behavioral realm, therapeutic realm, and biomedical realm, autism can become da bomb rather than being a bomb. And how can autism be a bomb? Well, da bomb, I should say. Let's take an example. Let's take a look at a hypothetical fellow named Takeshi, who's on the autism spectrum. He's very verbal, and his job is to provide transportation system information to lost patrons at Shinjuku Station in Tokyo, a really busy place. So we consider the characteristics of autism in these three areas. We're all too familiar with them. And what implications does that have for his employment? Well, if we think about what he does, providing transportation system information to lost patrons, if we think about the communication of people on the autism spectrum, how many of you will agree that those of us who are verbal tend to be detailed, factual, data-driven, truthful, repetitive? And how many of you have asked for someone to repeat the directions when you've asked them when you're lost? So it works. What about social interaction? He's interacting with perhaps hundreds of people a day. But we're talking about a population who may be challenged with typical social interaction. Until we think about what that interaction is. It tends to be fairly limited and predictable. A short greeting, a query as to how to get from one place to another, or when a train leaves, or where it goes. So that works out. And then the question is, where does he get this information? His coworkers have to look it up in a reference. This is one of his restricted interests. It's all memorized. So as a result, he can access all of this transportation system information faster than his coworkers. And because this individual has autism, he outperforms his typical coworkers who don't have autism. However, the key is that this person whatever early intervention that he had when he was younger, it worked. And this is what we need to do. We need to help those individuals on the spectrum, all over the spectrum, some who are verbal, some who are nonverbal, some who are incredibly severely affected. We've got to help them so that they can learn to live with their characteristics, leading a fulfilling and productive life. So here I am at age 4. As I mentioned, speech had begun to return. I got reevaluated. Instead of being considered as psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic, so things were moving up in the world. I discovered the wonderful world of watch motors. Using a sharp kitchen knife, I pop open the back of a watch, take out the hands, the gears, everything, and then put it all back together again. And the watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. My parents noticed this interest. They made a big deal about it. Instead of looking at the closed door of perhaps some really strange behavior, maybe this was something that could be used for an area of future study, a hobby, or maybe even employment. Had it been a previous century, I would have been a really good watchmaker. The self-awareness piece is really important because a good sense of self-awareness, where are your strengths, where are your challenges, that's a prerequisite for developing a good sense of self-determination. So being able to make good adult decisions. And you only know that if you're aware of where your strengths are and where your challenges are. So at age 6, I entered regular school kindergarten. Speech had pretty much returned. However, I was still a social and academic catastrophe. I guess walking around the classroom repeating the letter B over and over didn't endear me to my classmates. And academically, I was almost a grade behind in all of my subjects. It was a challenging time. People didn't know what to do. However, I had my interests. One of my favorite activities would be to go into the library and get all the books I could on my favorite subjects. Well, it could have been astronomy, could have been dinosaurs, could have been world history, could have been some other science. And there I would sit at my desk reading stacks of books. And this continued all through elementary school. Taking notes, copying diagrams. I remember in 3rd grade, a teacher came up to me when I had a stack of astronomy books on my desk, and she told me I'd never learn how to do math. But somehow I figured out just enough math to teach statistics at the university level. These days, it's much more encouraging, and I see situations where an educator would notice such a special interest and find a way to incorporate that into the curriculum to teach the individual whatever they need to learn. Bicycles had started to become a real interest of mine. There was nothing better than turning the bicycle upside down and spinning the real wheel for all it was worth. Eventually I got to riding the thing, and all of the moving parts and the relative mechanical simplicity of it I found fascinating, and the ability that I had with taking apart watches I transferred to bicycles, and soon I was taking bicycles down to their ball bearings and building them up again. So let's take a look at success. What could my interest in bicycles have to do with success? How in general do we promote success for those on the autism spectrum? We're still looking at employment here as one area of success. And I believe success in employment begins with possible jobs around the house. Most of us call those chores. However, the characteristics that chores share with jobs in the workplace is that you have to do them on a regular basis and you have to perform them at a certain proficiency, and you got to do them whether you want to or not. So involving the individual on the spectrum, giving them the job of feeding the cat, walking the dog, making your bed, whatever it might be. And for those individuals who aren't ready to do the entire task, maybe they could get the can of cat food out of the cupboard so that you can open it up. Or maybe you can open the thing, or maybe you can get the can, open it up, and they spooned it into the cat's dish, and then gradually turned the entire task over to them. As one gets older, you can start moving on to particular child-sized jobs. A paper route used to be a really good thing to do. At least in the United States, newspapers seem now to be delivered by some guy driving a truck and flinging them out of a window. But those days, a newspaper route had all of the aspects of a business. You had to perform a service, you had to collect your money, and you had to do it well, and you had to do it every day, whether you wanted to or not. However, there are plenty of other jobs out there where you can engage in making money and running your own business. And other possibilities might include a teenager who's really good at web design and interested in computers. Could they design a website for a local charity, a church, a synagogue, or some other organization? Is that something they could get? That's something that they could get engaged in. So I had this paper route. It worked really well, and it also involved riding my bicycle, so it certainly involved one of my interests. Well, at age 8, I'd spend hours cracking open small rocks with a big rock. I was fascinated by the shiny specks inside and the sharp edges. That eventually grew into special interests, other interests such as astronomy and weather, and still teachers remained concerned about my difficulties. So there's a real disconnect there, which fortunately I'm seeing less and less of. An individual on the autism spectrum who has a lot of skills in certain areas, but somehow they don't quite match up to what's expected in a school situation. And the question is, how are we going to teach that individual in a way that they're able to learn? So you have someone who's fascinated with any particular subject. Is there a way to work math into that subject? Reading, social studies, whatever it might be. Everybody learns better about what they're interested in. However, and for people on the autism spectrum, it's just to a much greater degree. If you're interested in something, you're probably really good at it too. And that's another characteristic of autism that I find that is often ignored. And that's the idea of twice exceptionality. The stuff that we're good at, we're incredibly good at. We're ridiculously good at. A friend of mine, for example, who likes to ask people when they were born. And he'll say, oh yeah, that was a Monday. And that makes you 980 so many 200 seconds old. And he'll be right, and that's about as fast as he calculates it. However, he has really significant challenges with sensory issues and social interactions, and most of the time he's unemployed. Is there a way that we can help him? Or another friend of mine who has a verbal IQ of over 200. And those of you familiar with scoring IQ tests know they don't go that high, so it's just a guess. But because of her challenges with typical social interaction, she'll never be able to find employment and never be able to keep a job the way we think about finding and keeping jobs. Or another person who's a friend of mine who's at the other extreme, where she has a gallon of autism and you might say 2 tablespoons of cerebral palsy. And she remains pre-verbal to this day, in her 30s. She could walk into this room, climb up the stairs, looking very awkward, looking like she would merit a diagnosis of severe mental retardation like she was given as a toddler. Well, that wasn't until her father noticed her typing words into a computer that he had no idea that she would know or could know. So if we fast forward to today, she could come right up to this podium and she could communicate with you just as I'm communicating with you, not verbally, but by typing responses to whatever questions you might have. So in this case, are we talking about someone who is low functioning? Is she high functioning? Or are we low functioning and figuring out how to talk about autism? So that's another challenge that we're facing. How do we talk about autism in ways that accurately describe the condition? Low functioning, high functioning, what does it mean? And in many cases, these classifications seem to overgeneralize the situation. So we have a situation here. We've got Ben, And he's faced with today's weekly general music quiz to classify selected instruments into their proper families by describing what other instruments they are grouped with. So, for example, he would say the trombone would be placed by indicating it's a brass instrument, it's made out of metal, and you group the trumpet, the French horn, and the tuba right with them. However, Ben is a high school student with high-functioning autism. He's frozen in fear because he just can't put into words where these instruments belong, and he fails at this type of test again. Now, further investigation indicates that he has difficulty with creative writing and math, but when properly supported by his paraprofessional, he performs at above grade level in drafting class and computer-aided design. So, what is causing Ben to have such difficulty in classes, and what can we do to use his strengths to promote success? Well, like many people on the autism spectrum, he's probably visually oriented. And he does well in drafting class, so drawing, so that suggests that that's where his strengths are. And what are we doing when we're asking Ben to classify instruments by writing out how instruments are classified? We're asking Ben to think in his second language. And in this case, second language is verbal interaction. So we're asking Ben, or we're asking anybody in this type of test, to translate visual language into verbal language. And for many of us on the autism spectrum, that can be very difficult. So how can we help Ben demonstrate his mastery of the subject material visually? And maybe it would just be as simple as having pictures of all of these instruments, and he can put them into their respective piles. So the brass, metal instruments in one place, the woodwinds in another, and the string instruments in yet another. So this is one way that we could look at Ben's strengths and help him be successful with what he's able to do. And maybe we could provide this as an option for the rest of the students as well, for the others who might benefit from presenting information visually. An interest, special interests, as defined by Tony Attwood, an interest of such great intensity that it interferes with daily functioning. How many of you know people like that? Is there a more positive spin that we can put on this? And one way I like to think about these interests, perhaps, is defining it as an interest of such great intensity that it provides a powerful motivator for learning curriculum, exploring career choices, reaching goals. So these are some of my special interests. They come and they go. Sometimes there's more than one of them at a time. And make sure you get them all, because there will be a quiz at the end. Oh, and here we have Adam. His special interest. He's a 14-year-old boy diagnosed with high-functioning autism, fascinated with airplanes, almost always finds a way to bring airplanes into his interactions with others. How many of you know people like that? They get stuck on a subject. In fact, he recently discussed vector thrust steering with an Air Force pilot until the gentleman tired after an hour of conversation on the subject. Fearful of flying, Adam's father gets particularly annoyed with his perseveration, as he'd rather remain on the ground running his miniature train set during the weekends. Well, I think we perhaps see a little bit of genetic factors here. So Dad perseverates on his train sets. His son perseverates on airplanes. And we all know, given the genetic factors, that parents get their autism from their kids. So in school, we see that Adam exhibits difficulties in reading comprehension, but when properly supported by his aide, performs at above grade level in mathematics. So rather than only permitting access to the special interest for good behavior, how can it be employed to educate Adam in mathematics, reading, social studies, and a number of other subjects? So those of you who know individuals on the spectrum who perseverate on particular subjects, what is it that causes those of us on the spectrum to do that? And one thing that might play a role is that the world, and in particular the social world, is very confusing, or can be very confusing for those of us on the autism spectrum. It can be very confusing. What are all these rules? Why does that person with autism seem to have so much trouble figuring out what everybody's doing, and why are they getting in so much trouble all the time? So one way to make things a little more predictable is to become a master at a particular subject and to drive the conversation all around that particular subject. Now things are a little bit more predictable. And that may be why he's doing that. Well, we have all kinds of tools to help people like Adam better understand the social world. And by using these tools, various social narratives, whether they're power cards, social stories, cartooning, video modeling, whatever it might be, we can help those individuals make better sense of their surroundings. How might we employ this passion to address Adam's curriculum needs? How many of you would agree that there's mathematics in airplanes? There's plenty of math. Can you get social studies? Sure, airplanes fly to all kinds of places. And you might want to study those cultures, where they go. And this is exactly how we might place this in an educational setting. Maybe introducing a subject by talking about how do you get from Moncton to South Africa? And how many layovers are there in the process? How long does it take? And in that way, now we can start studying cultures in other lands. So here I am at age 10. I was awfully concerned about the letter E, because I heard you have to drop E before adding ing. And wasn't this E going to get hurt when it falls to the ground? Isn't it poor social skills to be dropping letters like that? I had a friend who said he felt like a pizza, he didn't look like one, he didn't smell like one, so there were some other problems. I remember one day sitting at a restaurant, and my mother suddenly pointed, "Oh, look at that girl over there, she's giving you the eye." Well, I thought that was pretty disgusting. And I didn't want her to go blind. And I had plenty of marbles at home, I didn't need her eye anyways. We tend to think literally. And one reason why we might tend to think literally is that we have difficulty perceiving the nonverbal cues that inform us when someone's telling a joke or perhaps using sarcasm. And it's these things that, the good news is that we can be taught these things. However, it requires direct instruction. It requires direct instruction. So how do we provide that direct instruction? Let's take a look at the situation. We're in middle school. And it's summer, and it's recess, and you're one of those recess monitors, you're standing outside, you have your nice can of iceberg soda because it's hot, and there's a game of some kids playing tag football, for example, and we have the individual with autism sort of standing on the perimeter. How many of you have seen children with autism sort of standing or walking around the perimeter of a field in recess? Kind of looking on, but not really understanding how to join. And that also addresses a myth about autism, a myth that people on the autism spectrum don't want to engage in social interaction. I think what really happens is attempts are made, just like with everybody else, but they tend to have disastrous results. And you get enough bad results doing something, then you just kind of give up and don't want to do it anymore. So how do we help this individual join the game? How might this individual, at least initially, approach the situation? How many of you have seen a situation like this where perhaps a child with autism will just run over, insert themselves into the game, and then run away with the ball as fast as they can? Because isn't that the goal of the game? To get the ball and don't let anybody touch you. Sounds pretty simple to me. But there's all kinds of rules and nonverbal communication that goes on with these types of games. So how do we learn them? And similarly, as an adult, how does an adult, for example, join a conversation that they see going on in another area of a room that they're in? And how does that happen? Now, it looks like a single smooth maneuver where, for example, you notice a conversation, you walk over there, and next thing you know, you've joined the conversation. And with children on the playground, a number of these children seem to be able to just join a game without any words being exchanged. Suddenly they're part of the game and they've figured out what to do. However, these procedures can be broken down, and that's what we need to do to help individuals on the autism spectrum. And if we look at the situation, what I might teach a child or an adult on the autism spectrum when they desire to engage in social interaction is to first stop what you're doing. Stop walking, stop thinking about something else, stop nerding into your computer or whatever it is. And then once you stop what you're doing, you observe. Do you understand the rules of the game? Do they make sense to you? And likewise, does the conversation that you might want to join, does that make sense to you? Is this something you want to talk about? So as you gain more familiarity with the situation, then you deliberate. You decide, is this something I want to do, yes or no? Okay, I've decided I do want to do this, and then I act. And I engage in either the game or the conversation and join the group along with everybody else. Now, a good way perhaps to teach this is to use the SOTA acronym. And SOTA is something that everybody can remember, whether you're on the autism spectrum or not. And this acronym is just one of many educational tools that we can help people use to help individuals on the autism spectrum. So what we're talking about are the rules, the unwritten rules that people don't talk about, but somehow everybody, except those on the autism spectrum, seem to have figured out. We're referring to what is known as the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum. And here's a place where we find hidden curriculum. We're in the men's room. Sam came in second and he made 2 mistakes. What 2 mistakes did he make? He's right next to him. What's the other one? He's looking. I don't know why the ladies always answer faster than the guys on this, but it just kind of happens. Now, we do have a number of fellows in this audience, and I think you guys will agree with me that going to the bathroom is a pretty solitary experience. You kind of go in, you do your business, and you get out. This is a time to work on good social interaction skills. How many of you guys work on eye contact in the bathroom? And what if this gentleman over here on the computer were to be in the same bathroom as this fellow over here and start commenting on how nicely his shirt goes with his pants? Would he come out alive? And what if in an emergency situation where the guy runs into the bathroom, he's really got to conduct his business, and he makes it into the stall just barely. He conducts his business but didn't take into account the resources of the stall. Is he going to ask the guy next to him for some resources? Or what seems to most often happen is the guy comes out with one less sock. What about the ladies' room? Well, sometimes I see a whole row of ladies just get up at once, they take their bags and they're gone. Often I hear a lot of noise coming out of these rooms, so there must be social interaction. Sometimes I hear there's even a couch so you can get comfortable. And if one of you ladies runs out of toilet paper, what do? All you have to do is ask. Whereas a guy wouldn't be caught dead asking. Very different rules. Nobody talks about these rules. Somehow people just seem to pick them up, but if you break these rules, well, then there's really serious consequences. How can we teach these rules? Well, it might be through discussion, just like we had here. It might be through role play. It might be through social stories. power carts, and whatever it might be. Here's an example of video modeling. Dennis DeBott and I have teamed together to create an autism and safe travel video for those more independent individuals on the spectrum who will be traveling using airplanes, buses, trains, whatever it might be, but there still might be some challenges in understanding the unwritten rules while traveling. So let's take a look at this video and see how we can help people on the autism spectrum remain safe while traveling. So in this situation, we're looking at a situation involving air travel, but it could be when you're traveling in an airplane. You could be walking down the street in your very own community. You could be in a library. You might be in a school very much like this. And the point is, sometimes a guy's got to do just what a guy's got to do. So the first question is, where is there a safe place to conduct one's business? And that's usually pretty easy to find, as this fellow found right here. And now here are some of the rules for social interaction. The first rule is that there's silence, there's no talking, you've got to keep your distance. The second rule is that if it's crowded, as long as you look down and you look up, then you'll be okay. Some of us guys don't like crowds, so there's always the option to take a stall. And then finally, this is what you shouldn't do. Don't do that. You get into an awful lot of trouble. And by understanding the rules of social interaction in the men's room, us guys can be safe as well. Well, at age 13, you don't have to be on the autism spectrum to have difficulty with middle and high school. And it becomes a time of great challenge for many of us on the spectrum. I would say most of us on the spectrum. For me, it was actually easier. It was actually easier because in middle school is where you start seeing special interest clubs, classes, and activities. And music was a special interest of mine. I joined the band. Now I had a structured activity in which to mediate my interactions with others. Could always talk about music. Music became such an interest that I'd spend hours in the instrument closet learning how to play all the other instruments as well. So it was a special interest of mine. Musicians are also expected to be a little bit different, so it's okay if you're a little strange. And this may be some of the reason, or part of the reason, that I give music lessons to children on the autism spectrum. Because in addition to all the therapeutic benefits of engaging in music, you're providing a real-life key for that individual to develop interactions with others and to engage in the community as a musician, perhaps part of an ensemble, perhaps as a soloist. Another reason that I teach individuals on the autism spectrum music is that it's plain old fun. And then finally, I haven't figured out how to teach typical kids yet, so I just stick with the ones on the autism spectrum. They seem to make a lot more sense. And music, just like so many things for people with autism, they're for people all over the autism spectrum. Some of the individuals I teach are nonverbal and are really significantly affected. Others on the autism spectrum are hyperverbal, and the skills are all over the map. Some individuals could be professional musicians if they so chose, and others work harder. And then there are some others that I haven't quite figured out how to teach yet. So, but it's good for everybody, whether you're on the autism spectrum or not. So speaking of music, we have Valerie here. She's a student with autism. She's included in senior chorus. Despite intensive support from an aide and a well-planned behavioral program, Valerie moans continuously at a low pitch. So she does a lot of vocalizing, but nobody can really figure out what these sounds mean. And she continuously moans without regard as to whether her section is singing or not. How many of you know individuals on the autism spectrum who seem to vocalize a lot? So she's one of those. That is when she's even able to stand in place. She's a pacer. She walks around. She doesn't try to escape, but she definitely needs to walk around. If she was in this room, she probably wouldn't run out of the room, but she'd just be walking all over the place. You've also noticed that when Valerie paces, she quiets right down. So that's interesting as well. The music director is deeply concerned of the possible negative effect this behavior will have for the year-end concert of international music. How can you help the music director while keeping Valerie meaningfully included in the chorus rehearsals and the performance? So why is Valerie behaving this way? We might want to take a look at the work of occupational therapists who work with sensory issues. And it might be like Valerie, like many people on the autism spectrum, have a poor body-to-environmental relationship. And they have difficulty addressing the question, where is my body in relation to the environment? Well, let's try something. Everybody touch the back of your chair. It looks pretty good. All right, you can let go now. Now, how many of you had to turn around to visually locate the back of your chair before you could touch it? Or did you just kind of know where it was? Did you just take it for granted you knew where your body ended and the chair began? And most people, that's the way things work. But for many people on the autism spectrum, there can be great difficulty in knowing where the body ends and the environment begins. And the best way to figure out where your body is in the environment is to move. That's why we see a lot of people with autism moving. They move, they become aware of themselves, they become aware of their environment, which makes it particularly difficult for many people on the spectrum to sit still in school, like we expect so many people to do. And if you can't move, the next best thing is to make a noise and to vocalize. That can help you figure out where you are in the environment as well. So this is what might be happening with Valerie. Even if it isn't, or we can't quite figure out why, we do know that when she moves, her vocalizations go way down. So how might we employ these behaviors so that she can be meaningfully included in rehearsals and the performance? So some possibilities might include, how about having the chorus move while they sing? Sometimes choruses sway back and forth as they perform. That may be enough of Valerie, maybe it isn't, we don't know. Maybe we could have her come to the front of the chorus and engage in improvisational movement. We might find that she's surprisingly good in this area. Now, we wouldn't want her to be alone, so let's see if we can get 3 or 4 other volunteers to engage in improvisational movement in the front as well. Maybe she'd be really good beating a piece of percussion instrument, helping the chorus keep to their tempo. What my wife did with such a student is she stuck a flagpole in the kid's hand. And the flag on the flagpole matched whatever country a song was being sung from. So when they sang a song of Russia, she was walking around with a flag of Russia. When they sang a song of France, there was a French flag on the pole. And she loved it, the chorus loved it, Valerie's parents liked it, and it really added to the performance. So again, we're looking at how to use Valerie's strengths. What can she do to be successfully included and to enjoy the situation and to benefit? Sometimes an endeavor doesn't work out and you have to change plans. And what this slide depicts is a noisy restaurant where I had my first, you might say, real job, where I had to punch in and get a paycheck and all that stuff. Now, a noisy restaurant is not a good place for someone with sensory issues. So I'd get sensorially overloaded, even though we didn't have the terminology for it in those days, but that's what it was. And it caused us to sort of shut down, and I'd work slowly. And the last thing a restaurant manager wants is an employee who works slowly, especially when it's busy. So that means changing my plans and figuring out something else that would work much better. It meant thinking about bicycles. So again, instead of staring at the closed door of something that doesn't work, let's use my interests, being bicycles. So what I did is I'd get on my bicycle that I built from the ground up, from the spokes, the rim and the hubs, the ball bearings and everything else, and I'd make the rounds of a dozen or so bicycle shops in my area. I'd find the manager of the shop. Essentially, I'd nerd out with this manager on my bicycle and various components and how they all worked and who had won the Tour de France and all kinds of things like that. And then I'd ask him for a job. And I got 11 rejections, but all I needed was one job, and at the 12th place, I got hired on to repair bicycles. Now, this was something that I was good at. This was a position where I could regulate my sensory input and stay in the back in the shop fixing bicycles, or come out and help customers with questions, talking about my favorite subject, which was bicycles at that time. So again, it's vitally important to determine where the strengths and interests of individuals are on the autism spectrum. It actually works that way for everybody else as well. Most people try to find jobs where in fields that they're interested in and things that they're good at. Many people, though, can tolerate working in a position where they'd rather not be. They're not happy, but they can do it. But for people with autism, it just doesn't work out. So making sure the situation works, making sure the job fits, examining or considering the way the person with autism thinks. Now, most people with autism tend to be visually based. They tend to be photorealistic thinkers, but not all. I have a friend on the autism spectrum who's so non-visual that she can't read a map. She can't get any information from a map that's useful. So she's more of a word facts type person. So what we can say is that the thinking style of individuals on the spectrum, while it will likely be visually based, it may not be. And whatever it is, it's probably going to be to an extreme. And we also need to consider whatever challenges there are related to sensory, communication, and social interaction. Probably the person that best exemplifies this is this person over here, Temple Grandin, who is so successful in the field of humane cattle processing. She's probably the most well-known person in the world for having autism, we all know that, but also in the field of cattle processing and animal science. She's an expert there as well. And some people there know she has autism and other people don't. It's incidental or secondary to what she does. So because she has autism, because she has the visual skills that she has, she's able to outperform people who don't have autism. And this is, I think, a good way to think about employing the characteristics of autism. So moving along into adulthood, college was a utopia for me. I had more friends, no more bullies. If I wanted to ride my bicycle at midnight, I could find someone just as strange as I was to also ride at midnight. Dating occurs in college. That's something that just confused the heck out of me, and I still haven't quite figured it out. I find the subject interesting, probably because I can't figure it out, but fortunately, I don't have to worry about that anymore. So what about dating? I remember my first encounter. After spending a lot of time with this woman in undergraduate school, she told me that she really liked hugs and back rubs. Oh, gee, this is really cool, I thought. I have a brand new friend, and not only that, she doubles as a deep pressure Temple Grandin squeeze machine. Well, I guess she had other ideas. And after a long talk, I realized that not only did she want to be my girlfriend, she thought we had been dating for about a month. And I think this goes beyond the typical male cluelessness. But what this experience made me realize is that I needed to gain more knowledge in this area. I'd spend hours in bookstores reading texts on body language, dating, and I think dating is a challenge for a lot of people. There are so many books such as Dating for Dummies out there, and I don't think they're just written for people on the autism spectrum. So by the time I got to graduate school, I had a little more knowledge in this area, not experience, but knowledge, and hopefully would be able to pick up on cues a little bit better. So after spending more time, after meeting a lady in a music class, and at first agreeing to help each other with music and then going our separate ways, helping each other with homeworks, we started doing things socially together. And then suddenly at a beach, very much like this, she suddenly gave me a kiss, a hug, and held my hand. But by then I had the social story down. And the social story was, if a woman hugs you, kisses you, and holds your hand all at about the same time, it probably means they want to be your girlfriend. That being the case, you better have an answer right away. And that answer could either be yes, it could be no, or it could be further investigation and analysis as indicated. Well, it seemed to be a good thing to do, and we've been married for a little over 22 years. How she puts up with me, I don't know. But if you want to find out, you can read her contributions to my book, Beyond the Wall, in which she shares her experiences, you might say, from the other side of the autism spectrum. So these days, as an adult, well, I don't tell too many people I'm an adult because then they might make me take responsibility or do something boring. Like many of us on the autism spectrum, I spend my time in a sheltered workshop where people are expected to perseverate on certain subjects for hours, days, and sometimes entire lifetimes. And we get other people to perseverate on these subjects as well. Sometimes social interaction between community members are not the best. Some people refer to the place as a university. If you want to find undiagnosed people with Asperger's syndrome, check out your professors. So, speaking of professors, let's take a look at the case of Burton, professor of mathematics at a well-known institution of technology right outside of Boston. And we examine the characteristics, communication, social interaction, restricted interests, what are the employment implications as a professor, whether it's mathematics, whether it's a different subject. Well, the lectures are detailed, factual, data-driven, truthful, and when a lesson is taught well, you get the preview, the subject, and then the review. So in other words, repeat, repeat, repeat. That works. The interactions are fairly limited and predictable. Interacting with students, they generally have similar questions. How do you do this? How do you do that? That works. And this is his area of focused interest. Just as my area of focused interest at Adelphi University is the autism spectrum and researching into helping those on the autism spectrum lead fulfilling and productive lives to their greatest potential. And strictly because Burton has autism, he outperforms his typical coworkers who don't have autism. So, achieving success, if we can find ways to focus on the interests and strengths, many people on the spectrum, probably the third most common special interest of people on the spectrum has to do with transportation system information. Things are predictable. Trains are supposed to run on rails. They don't go places where you don't expect them to go. Is there a place for them? Then there was the young lady who probably could have been the best horse veterinarian in the region, but had no interest in communicating with people until we got into a discussion about the requirements for being a veterinarian. And how are you going to communicate to the owner of the horse and how to keep it healthy? Well, suddenly she had motivation in which to improve her communication skills. And then there was the fellow who had such a hypersensitive sense of smell. One day, his father was cooking some eggs in a pot, and the son asked, "Why are you using a copper pot?" Which caused Daddy, the engineer, well, that should be another characteristic of autism. He was an engineer. And actually, Dad was diagnosed as on the spectrum. And that made Dad realize his son had such a sensitive sense of smell, he could smell what metal was being heated up in the shape of a pot to cook some food. And somehow he got that parlayed into where he'd go into an aircraft hangar, and the son would smell an engine of an airplane and say, yeah, that one needs an oil change. I mean, he didn't go up and sniff it like a dog or anything, but he was able to catch the ambient smell. So he could do something that nobody else could do. And because he could do these things, I guess people tolerated his differences. And as we look for finding employment success for people who are more challenged on the autism spectrum, what are some things that we can do by looking at the characteristics, recognizing where the challenges are? I mean, here I am talking about the strengths of people with autism, using those strengths to lead fulfilling and productive lives, looking at a characteristics-based as opposed to a deficit-based model of considering autism. Well, what about the challenges of autism? Do they exist? Are they real? Well, if they weren't real, Martha wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't be here trying to figure it out. So these challenges are there, they're real, and we can't deny them. And we've got to find ways to help people with autism work through these challenges. However, we also have to be aware of and find ways to use strengths. So we're looking at the characteristics. What employment attributes can we find to match with those characteristics? And what possible positions might we find for this person? Well, let's take a look at one of these. Sensory stimulation. I was in Japan talking with a parent of a teenager who had limited verbal ability, and one of his favorite activities would be to stick his finger under a water faucet and spray water all around the room. And even though there were 4 or 5 floods in the house, the parent still supported her son's interest. So then the question came, what can he do for employment? What is he going to do for a job when he gets older, when he ages out of school, which is coming up really, really soon? So we need to take a look at what interests this child. What is he good at? Well, this business of sticking your finger in a faucet and spraying water, what is that individual getting from that activity? And if we think about it sensorially in this case, he's getting a lot of pressure on the thumb, some deep pressure. He probably enjoys that. He also may enjoy the visual of water arcing across the room and then splatting in certain patterns on the wall on the other side. There's probably a nice sound as well that he's enjoying. So what that suggests is that he enjoys spraying water at high pressure. What employment possibilities are there that involve spraying water at high pressure? So we think about, what about being a fireman? And that's probably the highest pressure you'll get. But at the same time, you're under pressure to have good communication skills. You have to be able to follow orders barked out by your supervisor, by the captain, and you also have to bark out orders yourself sometimes. And if communication's an issue, maybe that's not going to work. What are some other opportunities? And they may center around power washing, whether it's washing sidewalks, buildings, cars. And if this individual is really caught up with the idea of fire engines and firefighting and all of that, might we be able to find a friendly firehouse where he could go in and help clean the fire engine? So we can put these interests together, these abilities together. What about working in a greenhouse, for example, or landscaping, watering flowers, watering the grass? Well, you're definitely involved in spraying water, but you don't water flowers with a high-pressure hose. So if we were going to consider that, we'd also have to look into just how important this business of spraying water at high pressure is, or whether he'd just be happy spraying water. So this is one way that we can look at the characteristics of autism and find ways to match them up to potential employment situations for those individuals. And come to think of it, this business of matching up skills and desires for employment is the same that we do for everybody else, or we should. So there's nothing really different. The only difference is understanding the characteristics of autism. So there's other possibilities as well. Strong visual motor skills, they can definitely be put to use. If there are savant skills, what about my friend who can tell you how old you are in about 2.5 seconds? He'd be great for tax preparation. And actually, he does do a lot of that. So he's very busy during tax season. Another resource that's really good at looking at the characteristics of people with autism and employment is from Coulter Video's Asperger's Syndrome at Work. And this is a very interesting video because what Coulter does is he follows 5 or 6 people on the autism spectrum. 5 or 6 people who are gainfully employed in a competitive employment situation, and because they have Asperger's syndrome, they outperform their coworkers who don't have Asperger's syndrome. So one of the people he follows is really good at numbers, and all he has to do is see an invoice number, and he automatically knows who the person is whose name would be on the invoice, and he even remembers how much is on the invoice. So he does better than everybody else. Or the librarian, for example, who one of his special interests or perseverations is making sure all the books are in the right place according to their Dewey Decimal System number. So that's something that you want, looking at these characteristics and finding ways to make them useful. Perhaps this will be my next book. Dealing with a situation, dealing with a condition that's characterized by unusual and excessive eye contact. Now, people with this condition also have a pathological need for social interaction on meaningless subjects such as the weather. And there's also this assumption that people with this condition understand what other people are thinking. And really all I've done is I've described typical behavior in the way that autism is described. And what that suggests is that we're looking at the cultural nature of autism as well. And the way the prevalence rates are going these days, it may be that within the next generation, there's going to be more of us on the autism spectrum than not. We're taking over, and we really will need this book. So on that note, I want to thank you for your participation. I want to thank you for
If this video inspires you to support our important work, you can contribute by visiting autismcanada.org to make a secure donation.